In these cursed halls, whispers never die. Candles flicker against damp stone walls, and the rusted gates groan as if protesting every secret they have held for centuries. Imagine walking deeper into a fortress where screams once carved the air, where the stench of scorched flesh mingled with iron and smoke. What they uncovered beneath the torture chamber floor would chill the blood of even the bravest soul. Before we enter, remember, if you dare to uncover more of history's darkest truths, hit that subscribe button now. The figure at the center of this nightmare was no common executioner. She was born into nobility, draped in silks, surrounded by power, and taught from a young age that her desires were above question. Yet hidden in her childhood was a scene that seared into her mind forever, watching her uncle burned alive as punishment for treason. His screams became the first symphony she ever truly remembered, and that memory would later shape her twisted fascination with fire and pain. The world around her was harsh, ruled by superstition and fear. Torture was not just punishment, but spectacle performed in public squares to terrify the masses into obedience. But while others flinched, she leaned closer, studying the hooks, the blades, the cries. Where the crowd turned away, her eyes glowed with a dreadful curiosity. It was as though suffering was not a warning to her, but an invitation. Her first victim did not come from the battlefield or the dungeons. It was a servant girl barely older than 16 accused of dropping a silver tray. For most nobles, such clumsiness would mean dismissal. For her, it meant an opportunity. The girl was dragged to a cellar lit by only one candle, its flame casting long shadows that seemed to mock her pleas. There, a crude iron hook was placed into the fire until it glowed red. The girl's screams that night would echo through the corridors for days. The scent of burning hair and flesh seeped into the very stones. The noblewoman inhaled it not with disgust, but with fascination, as if she believed pain carried secrets only she could unlock. When the servant finally collapsed into silence, the lady ordered her body hidden beneath the flagstones. But she returned again and again to that cellar, not out of guilt, but to stare at the marks on the wall where fingernails had clawed stone in desperation. From that night forward, her cruelty blossomed. Each mistake, each insult, each whisper against her authority became fuel. Villagers whispered that anyone who crossed her vanished. Some believed she sent them away. Others whispered they were taken by wolves. The truth was worse. Beneath her fortress, the chamber grew into a shrine of suffering. Hooks, blades, and chains lined the walls like trophies of a grotesque obsession. Victims remembered the sound before the pain, the hiss of iron as it plunged into flame, the crackle of flesh when red-hot steel kissed skin. She wielded blades with precision, carving not for death, but for endurance, ensuring every cut was shallow enough to prolong agony. She would whisper into their ears, asking if they felt the same fire she had seen consume her uncle years ago. For her, each scream was a hymn, each scar a scripture. One peasant boy no older than 12 was caught stealing bread. Instead of turning him to the magistrates, she claimed him as her own punishment. In the dungeon, he was stripped bare and forced to watch the hook glow brighter with every passing second. His sobs filled the chamber, echoing like a prayer denied. When the hook pressed into his shoulder, his voice broke, and she smiled not as a woman but as a priestess presiding over a grotesque ritual. But even in her reign of terror, shadows stirred against her. A priest sent to bless the land began hearing confessions too strange to ignore. Mothers spoke of children gone missing. Fathers whispered of screams carried on the night wind. The priest warned others, but fear kept lips sealed. Yet he knew where silence reigns, evil thrives. And so he began to watch her quietly, patiently, waiting for the mask of nobility to crack. Still, she grew bolder. Her collection of tools expanded. Razors sharpened until they could slice parchment in silence became her new obsession. She loved to run the blades across the skin without pressure, watching victims shiver before she finally pressed harder. And always the hook returned burning red, demanding flesh. But what she did not know was that every act, every hidden scream was leading her closer to exposure. Her empire of pain was vast, but the walls that concealed it were beginning to tremble. The ledger kept by her steward was the first hairline crack columns of names balanced against shipments of coal and candles, but the numbers never matched the village registers, as if people could vanish like wax under flame. The priest borrowed the book under the pretense of blessing accounts and found pressed between pages a ribbon scorched at the edge and a smear the color of rust, and he whispered a prayer that shook more from fear than faith. That night he returned to the fortress under a sky bruised purple, counting his steps to calm his pulse as the wind pushed the iron gate to a slow, reluctant yawn. Inside, the stones sweated with damp and the air tasted of metal, and somewhere below a chain clinked as if a restless memory tugged at it, promising that the truth was not buried, only waiting. In the village, a mother clutched a wooden toy horse, its tail singed as though passed too near a candle, and told the priest her boy had been hired to carry coal to the manor but never came home. The priest listened to the details, the time the cart, the promised coin, and realized each story mapped to a night when the fortress chimneys burned hotter than winter, demanded a calendar of smoke and silence that formed a pattern he could not ignore. He sought an ally in a minor magistrate, a thoughtful man with ink-stained fingers who understood numbers better than threats. They cross-checked tithes, grain tallies, and work rosters, and the magistrate paled when he saw how often a debt disappeared on days when a new servant was hired, as though payments were made in souls instead of silver, and he agreed to help, but only in secret, for the noblewoman's reach was long. Meanwhile, in the fortress, an accident spawned a confession. A junior guard sliced his palm on a hidden razor while polishing shackles and fled to the chapel, blood stippling the floor like red punctuation. There, trembling and white as wax, he told the priest about a false wall behind the wine racks, a passage that led to a room where hooks slept in braziers like coals dreaming of storms. His words were halting, but the map they drew was clear enough to damn. The priest and the magistrate returned at dawn with 4 trusted soldiers and a cart piled with empty barrels to disguise their purpose. They moved through the cellars, counting casks aloud so eavesdroppers would hear only routine inventory. And then the priest pressed his palm to the mortar where the guard had pointed. Warm, impossibly warm, until a clever latch clicked and the wall sighed inward to reveal a narrow throat of darkness. They stepped into a chamber that felt like a lung that had forgotten how to breathe, a place where sound dulled and time seemed coated in ash. Hooks ringed the room in iron brackets, each above a shallow tray blackened by heat, and on a central table lay razors ordered by size, their edges so fine they seemed to drink the candlelight. Beside them was a book bound in oiled leather, its first page a neat obsessive hand that titled the volume "The Language of Endurance." The diary was not a rant, but a curriculum. Diagrams of nerve paths, experiments on cooling and reheating iron to measure how long skin would remember pain, notes on how the scent of tallow affected panic, and in the margins, small observations like fear swells the breath. Wait for the second cry to begin the cut. The priest's hands shook as he turned a page and found a pressed posy of wildflowers, brittle and singed, labeled only with a child's initials. A soft scrape turned their blood to ice, and a trap door near the hearth shivered as if exhaling. The magistrate signaled the soldiers, and when they heaved it open, a ladder sank into blackness that tasted of soot and old cries. From below came a single clink, then the faintest thread of human breath, and the priest, against every instinct to flee, lowered himself first, whispering that if there was even one heartbeat left, he would not leave it to die in the dark. At the bottom, they found a boy curled against the stone wrists, raw but eyes still reflecting candlelight like a night animal's. He flinched from touch until the priest showed the toy horse, and then the child clung to him with a strength born of terror. When they raised him into the chamber and he saw the hooks, he hid his face and mouthed a word they could scarcely hear again, and the priest realized with a jolt that the lady would return before dusk to finish what she had begun, turning their discovery into a race against the clock. The soldiers argued whether to flee with the boy or stay and gather proof, But the magistrate knew retreat meant the fortress walls would close again and the diary would vanish into fire. So they hid the child in the chapel and returned to the chamber, sketching each device with charcoal and parchment, their hands trembling as if afraid the drawings themselves might cry out. That afternoon, the fortress filled with an unusual stillness, as though servants sensed some invisible balance tipping. The noblewoman returned earlier than expected, her carriage wheels grinding on gravel like a warning drumbeat, and in her eyes was a brightness too sharp to be joy. It was hunger, the same spark seen when iron first kisses flame. She descended to the cellar with 2 attendants, her laughter thin and jagged as glass, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth that leaked a faint trickle of red. The magistrate and priest, hidden behind the false wall, watched her place the bundle on the table, unwrap it and reveal the limp arm of another stolen child, veins pale against candlelight. With ritualistic care, she chose a razor and traced its cold edge along the skin, humming a lullaby that once comforted her, but now sounded like a dirge. When she lifted the iron hook from the brazier, the chamber flared orange, and the attendants whispered blessings, as if they believed pain was a form of worship. The investigators held their breath, knowing that to interrupt now meant death. Yet the boy in the chapel began to scream, waking from nightmare, his voice carrying through stone like a ghost's accusation. The noblewoman froze, head-tilted eyes narrowing, then barked an order, sending one attendant to investigate. The magistrate gripped the priest's arm. This was their only chance to strike while her attention wavered. The soldiers burst from hiding with steel-drawn torches thrust forward like sudden dawn. The lady did not cower, but smiled, raising the glowing hook as though it were a scepter. The air filled with clashing cries, soldiers shouting, the priest calling upon God, the hiss of fire protesting the disturbance, and for a moment history held its breath. Steel met steel as the attendants resisted with desperate fury, one slashing with a hidden blade, while the other hurled coals from the brazier. Sparks cascaded across the chamber, igniting tapestries of human skin stretched on frames, and the walls themselves seemed to burn with the weight of sins revealed. The noblewoman struck like a serpent, swinging the hook to tear through a soldier's shoulder, his scream filling the chamber with raw terror. She moved with a precision born of countless rehearsals, every step choreographed by years of cruelty, as though the chamber itself lent her strength. But the priest clutching the diary shouted the names of the children scrawled within each word, striking her like a curse. Her composure cracked. Her smile faltered, and for the first time she looked not like a queen of torment, but a cornered beast snarling against the light that had finally found her. The magistrate lunged forward, pinning her wrist against the heated brazier, the smell of burning flesh rising in bitter smoke. She shrieked a sound that shook the chamber more than any victim's cry had ever done, and in that moment the power she wielded for so long began to crumble, leaving behind only the raw, unmasked terror of a woman about to lose her throne of hooks and blades. Dragged from the chamber, she clawed at the stones with blackened fingers, shrieking oaths that promised eternal vengeance. Villagers gathered as the soldiers hauled her into the square, their eyes wide with disbelief as whispers turned into roars of fury. Every missing face suddenly explained by the monster in their midst. The magistrate ordered her shackled to a cart, but she spat defiance, claiming the screams she harvested were sacred music that the people would wither without her rituals. Mothers covered their children's ears, and the priest raised the diary high, shouting that her own hand had written her damnation. The crowd surged closer, throwing stones, curses, and broken tools. One father held aloft the shoe of his daughter, the last thing found near the fortress, and his sobs broke the crowd into a storm of grief, driven rage voices rising like thunder against the lone figure who once silenced them with fear. At the hastily assembled tribunal, torches cast wild shadows across her face as accusations poured like arrows. Witnesses spoke of wagons that never returned, of smoke too thick for kitchens, of guards silenced with coin or threats. Each testimony stripped her nobility, revealing nothing but raw cruelty laid bare before the law. Yet she did not beg. With lips cracked and bleeding, she smiled through the proceedings, promising that pain was eternal. that even if her body burned, the hooks would swing again in another hand. Her voice sent shivers down the hall, a final attempt to seed terror in hearts already hardened by truth. The sentence was inevitable execution by fire, the very element she had worshipped in her twisted rites. When the verdict was read, the square erupted in a sound that was neither joy nor relief, but a raw, primal release of years of silent mourning, the air trembling with the weight of collective justice. The day of her death dawned, gray clouds hanging heavy as if the sky itself hesitated to witness. Bound to the stake, she glared at the crowd, her eyes burning brighter than the torches, daring them to look away, daring them to see themselves reflected in the cruelty they allowed to fester for so long. When the fire caught, her screams split the morning, mingling with the hiss of green wood and the crackle of pitch. The crowd did not cheer, but stood in solemn silence, watching the figure who had feasted on their fear finally swallowed by the same flames she had wielded as a crown. The priest, clutching the rescued boy, whispered that justice was not triumph, but warning that evil thrives in shadows of silence, that power unchecked always breeds cruelty. His words spread through the crowd like seeds, some taking root in hearts too weary to forget. When the ashes cooled, the magistrate sealed the diary within the chapel walls, swearing it would never guide another hand. Yet in nights when the wind rattled shutters and chimneys, moaned villagers claimed they still heard faint clinks of chains and the hiss of iron in fire, as though her chamber had not been destroyed, but merely waiting hungry beneath the earth. Years passed, but the scars remained etched not only in memory, but in stone. The fortress stood blackened, its windows, empty sockets staring at the hills, and children dared one another to run to the gate at dusk, swearing they could hear a woman's laughter tangled in the wind. The rescued boy grew into a quiet man, carrying on his shoulder the faint scar left by the glowing hook. He never spoke of the chamber, but his silence weighed heavier than screams, and when his own children asked why he woke sweating at night, he only told them to keep away from fire. The priest aged with a burden that never lightened. Each sermon carried an undercurrent of warning, reminding the congregation that evil is not born in shadows, but nurtured by silence. His voice cracked more each year until people whispered he had given so much of himself to resisting her that his soul was singed like parchment near flame. Travelers came curious about the legend of the noblewoman of hooks and blades, scratching their names into the ruined walls as if to prove their courage. Yet more than one visitor returned pale, insisting they heard a voice whisper their own name in the cellar, or saw a hook swing gently without a breath of wind. Artists and poets seized upon the tale, painting her with hair ablaze and eyes like coals, a figure both monstrous and enthralling. Her story slipped into folklore told by firelight as a warning to children. Do not wander at night, do not steal bread, or the lady with burning hooks will claim you. But scholars argued she was not a demon, but a symptom that her cruelty was enabled by a system where nobles answered to no one, where the cries of peasants were muffled by fear of reprisal. They warned that if society forgets, another such figure could rise cloaked in wealth and authority, smiling while the fires are stoked again. The magistrate who unmasked her spent his later years writing, trying to explain in cold ink what he had witnessed. But his journals dissolved into grief halfway through sentences. One page ended simply with the words, "The chamber still breathes in my dreams." The fortress was eventually abandoned, its stones quarried by villagers who wanted no monument to her memory. Yet the cellar remained untouched, sealed behind rubble, as if even those who destroyed her feared to disturb the ground where so much agony had soaked. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered fragments, iron hooks warped by heat razors, dulled with age, and a child's toy horse burned on one side. Newspapers reported the finds as curiosities, but locals shook their heads, warning that to bring them into the light was to invite her laughter back into the world. And so her legacy lingers, a ghost stitched into the fabric of history, a woman who turned torture into ritual, who believed fire and blades could grant her power beyond mortality. And though her body turned to ash, her story reminds us that cruelty is not bound to one century. It waits in silence until fear and power once more conspire to give it breath. As the centuries rolled on, the story of her cruelty became a parable passed between generations, less a tale of one woman's madness and more a warning of what unchecked power can become. Grandmothers whispered it to restless children, not merely to frighten them, but to remind them that silence in the face of evil is complicity. In dusty archives, the priest's diary survived hidden among church records. Scholars who translated its brittle Latin spoke of passages describing not only the tortures, but the strange serenity with which she recorded them, as though she were cataloging flowers instead of agonies, and that dispassion disturbed them more than the acts themselves. One historian argued that her obsession with hooks and razors mirrored the age's obsession with spectacle public executions torture as theater, except she removed the audience, choosing to revel alone in the intimacy of pain. In this isolation, cruelty became art and victims her unwilling canvas. The legend spread across borders woven into Gothic novels where noblewomen became witches dripping blades in candlelit castles. Playwrights used her tale to criticize tyranny, transforming her into a symbol of aristocracy devouring the poor. Thus her crimes lived on not only in fear but in literature, her hooks etched into culture itself. But for the villagers, the horror was simpler and closer. They remembered the missing faces, the silent dinners, the beds that stayed empty. Their folklore focused not on razors or fire, but on the absence of laughter, the way joy had been stolen from homes one child at a time, until the village itself seemed muted by grief. Over time, officials tried to erase her, striking her name from records, insisting the fortress was merely a ruin with no story. But the people kept whispering, and the ruins kept groaning in storms. And so her ghost resisted erasure, proving that memory once soaked in blood cannot be scrubbed away by decree. Modern psychologists studying the case called her an early example of sadistic compulsion, noting how trauma, like witnessing her uncle's fiery death, can twist into fascination when paired with privilege and impunity. Yet they admitted no diagnosis could capture the abyss she carved in her victims' lives. The hooks and razors themselves, recovered in fragments, were locked in museum vaults, labeled as iron instruments, origin uncertain. Curators hesitated to display them, fearing the artifacts carried more than rust, fearing that to place them behind glass would transform suffering into spectacle once again. Journalists investigating the site interviewed descendants of the rescued boy who still kept the scorched toy horse in a wooden box. One great-granddaughter confessed that her father refused to let her play near fire, always warning flame remembers, and she wondered if trauma itself could be inherited like blood. And so the tale circles endlessly, not as entertainment but as caution, a reminder that cruelty once fed grows insatiable, and that every system, every society must guard against those who smile while sharpening blades. For history whispers that the chamber is never truly gone. It waits patient for silence to fall again. The last witnesses of her terror died long ago, but their testimonies still echo in the brittle manuscripts they left behind. In faded ink, one line stands stark. She believed pain was a prayer, and every scream was her answer. Those words passed across centuries, chill scholars who realize they are not reading fiction, but fragments of lived agony. By the 19th century, Romantic historians reframed her story through the lens of Gothic fascination, painting her as half-witch, half-queen, a creature who stood outside humanity. Yet this myth-making, while dramatic, dulled the sharper truth that she thrived not in darkness alone, but in the blindness of her peers who chose silence over confrontation. Villagers who lived near the ruins still told stories at winter hearths of hooks swinging on their own in the windless cellar, of children who vanished when they dared to taunt her name aloud. Skeptics laughed, but no one volunteered to spend a night inside the fortress where the stones seemed to hold memory like a wound that never closed. In one chilling account from the early 20th century, workers quarrying stone from the fortress unearthed a wall cavity stuffed with scorched parchment. Most crumbled to dust when touched, but one piece bore a sketch unmistakable in its simplicity. A child's face, contorted eyes, wide mouth open in eternal scream. The workers fled and never returned. The ruins eventually became overgrown ivy, swallowing stone owls nesting where guards once patrolled. But the earth beneath remained restless, giving up relics after heavy rains, fragments of shackles, shards of razors, bone splinters that dogs carried back to the village. Each discovery rekindled the whispers, each artifact a reminder that her cruelty resisted burial. Modern criminologists studied her through the lens of power and pathology, arguing that she exemplified how unchecked dominance transforms trauma into ritual. One chilling paper noted that her obsession with red-hot hooks was not random but symbolic, a way to reenact the burning of her uncle, turning victimhood into mastery of fire. The diary preserved in fragments revealed another disturbing truth. She saw herself not as executioner, but as healer convinced that pain could purify that agony, stripped away lies to reveal the soul's raw essence. This twisted theology blurred cruelty with devotion, making her crimes all the more insidious because she believed them sacred. Even today, the site of the fortress draws curious souls, historians, and thrill-seekers alike. Some claim to hear the faint rasp of metal. When night falls, others insist the air near the cellar tastes metallic, like iron on the tongue. Whether haunting or imagination, the place refuses to fade into mere ruin. It insists on memory. The boy who survived carried the story through bloodlines, though each generation softened it to shield children from nightmares. Yet the scars, both physical and invisible, stretched forward proof that trauma ripples beyond its time-shaping lives, long after the flames cooled. In that sense, her cruelty still lives. And so we end where we began, in cursed halls, where screams once carved the air, where iron glowed and blades whispered across trembling flesh. Her empire of horror collapsed in fire, yet her legacy endures, warning us that cruelty is never just history. It waits in silence, nurtured by fear and by silence itself. What horrors are we ignoring today? Like, share, and comment to help us unveil more of history's darkest secrets.